Thank you very much for the invitation to be here. I just came from Bremen, where we had the event about the 20th anniversary of German unification in Bremen with a formal festival act and the speech of the new president of Germany, of Mr. Wolf. And in general, now we are coming to an end with all these 20th anniversaries, because we started last year. With the beginning of last year, because in that time, 20 years ago, it started the roundtable in Poland. And I think it's important in order to understand what happened in Germany, you have to understand not only what happened in Germany, but really what happened in Europe at all. And we had in that time, if you look back from 1985, Mr. Gorbachev governing to being the General Secretary of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union. This was important for us because if you listened or read his speeches, you could understand there's another kind of thinking. He tried to reform communism because he understood that communism in that way he experienced wouldn't survive and wouldn't challenge all these problems of that time. But on the other hand, this was an old nomenclatura, an old-fashioned communist party, and he tried to encourage people to change with so-called glasnost and perestroika, transparency and reforms. And so from that time it started that there was a new thinking. There was an understanding of global challenging. There was an understanding of the competition of the two big powers, NATO and Warsaw Pact, and especially the leading nations. And so there was, in our case, growing awareness that if things will change in our own country, then not again tanks will destroy all of that. Which happened in 1953, the uprising in East Germany. In that time, it was only some weeks after the foundation of GDR in the beginning of the 50s. And we know today that there were involved almost 2 million people in 700 cities. So it was really not only a demonstration in Berlin, which usually people know, but it was really an uprising, and the tanks destroyed all hopes of the people. And similar things happened in Hungary in '56, and you know the socialism with a human face, the Czech and Slovak hopes and perspective in 1986. And all that experiences was that all change will be destroyed. All hope will be destroyed because tanks were coming and destroyed all these developments. And only in the second half of the 80s, there was a growing hope that that will not happen again. I belong to what is called usually the opposition in GDR. These were groups, mostly of them inside of the churches, because the church was in East Germany, in the communist part of Germany, the only institution which could organize itself in a freely way. We had an elected leadership, we had our own rooms, we had our own communication and education institutions. I myself, for instance, when I, by pressure, lost my place at school and had to cut my education after the 10 years of school, I went to the school of the church. And so I finished my studies and studied theology and philosophy, and so I could have my career inside of the church. And when it became later than in the end of the 80s, when it became foreign minister, only that first 10 years of school were acknowledged publicly, official. All this other was not an acknowledged education of that time. That happened in that time, and so you had inside of the church a free communication, a free education, and this is a background why so many clergymen took part and played an important role in the peaceful revolution in East Germany in '89. I can't tell you all that, it would be too long, but it's important to have that framework, that on the one hand, there was that hope which we had, the hope of Poland, of the Hungarians, that not again tanks will come. And in the years before, we thought that it would be a question of honesty, is a question of moral and dignity to be in opposition, to be engaged, to say the truth, although it was not wished and you could come under pressure. But it was more a moralistic behavior. Then, in the end of the 80s, we started to hope that really things could be changed. And that's why we started to organize organizations outside of the church, because it was clear for us church can't be a structural opposition against the state, and you need political organization. And so we started, in my case, to found the Social Democratic Party. Others started to have movements, and I think you have got the name of Neues Forum, New Forum, or the Outbreak, Democratic Outbreak, and Demokratischer Aufbruch, and such kind of organizations with fantastic names, making clear that there's hope that people will be engaged in coming from the civil society. And I think this was an important point for that time, that although we had the agreements from the Helsinki process in the 70s, that there was more linkage between East and West, that there was, especially in the third dimension of that Helsinki process, question of human contact, the question of media, more transparency, and asking the question of human rights. This dimension was very important and gives us some space of information, some space of acting, and we could all the time show that papers of that Helsinki process of CSCE, that you have signed it, all these principles, and we tried to involve people to be encouraged and to demand their own rights. In the end of the 80s, what I mentioned, we founded this party. It happened in other cases. In Poland, it started with a round table. You can call it a negotiated revolution, because the disaster of the Polish communists was so strong that, and economically, that they couldn't find a way out. And so in the end, under the pressure of the underground Solidarność, they were so much under pressure that they agreed to have a round table with the opposition and the communists. And in the end, they had a half-free election. And after that, in summer '89, the first non-communist prime minister in Poland was Tadeusz Mazowiecki. And that encouraged us to go forward in the same way. In Hungary, they started to open the wall to Austria. And so people got hope. During the summer in East Germany, we had some tensions in East Germany between that people who only wanted to leave the country because they thought, we don't like to live here. And there was a wall. It was not possible legally to go out, but that gave away the Hungarians, and so during the summer '89, 50,000 people via Budapest left the country. And so there was the other part, the opposition, who tried to convince the others, stay here and fight together with us for change. And so there was some tension, but in the end, all these different groups in the population, it came together, and so it was possible to convince people to go to the streets, and that thousands and thousands came. And we founded these parties, so you had leadership. On the other hand, people making pressure, and so we were successful. In October, we succeeded that it was a very important day, the 9th of October. November came later, as usual in the year. So the 9th of October was a special date because in Leipzig there was a big demonstration of 70,000 people. And the communists were prepared to have violent, with violent and with military to prevent and to push them away. I experienced it in Magdeburg with 10,000 people around the Magdeburg church, the main church there, the Magdeburg Dome. And it was very interesting that I experienced that day. In the evening, 2 days before, we had founded the Social Democratic Party, and I gave the information there in public. And then we had, in the end of such kind of meetings, a public prayer. And so a young man came with a candle and said, I wish and ask God not to meet my father today again. And we were very astonished, why? And then he told, my father is outside with that weaponed military troops. And if we would meet, it would be a bloodshed. And so it was a very emotional situation. And it succeeded. It happened in that day. And from that 9th of October, we were in that opposition groups, we were personally sure, there was no guarantee, but we personally were sure that we will succeed with democracy. And then we worked for that, we prepared what was to do for establishment, free elections, and so on. And then we prepared the round table, similar as in Poland, which it happened before in Hungary too. And so we prepared how to establish democracy. And it needed the pressure from the people on the streets. Every week, thousands and thousands of people went to the street to demand freedom and democracy. And then there was a misunderstanding because the Communist Party, in the end of 9th of November, they had decided this day a new bill about traveling. This was not a really special thing because we had the disadvantage to other communist countries in which it was possible you had got in Hungary, in Poland, the right to travel. Every 2 years, whatever, could travel to the Western countries. And so they decided, they were under pressure with all the demonstrations, they tried to take the initiative to get the way and the policy in their hands. And so they decided that bill for traveling. And Mr. Schabowski, in this press conference, I think the most of you have seen the photos and the film about that, the video. He answered when he was asked when it is possible to do so, and he said immediately. But the misunderstanding was that it was not opening the war. It was only giving everybody the right, as usual in other countries, to go with application, and after that everybody will get the Erlaubnis, the visa to go out. And so, but people, after that demonstrations, you have to be aware, every week thousands and thousands went to the street with demonstrations. And so people went to the wall, And thousands came, and from that pressure, they opened the wall and went through. And there was not shot because the days before, they didn't shoot too, the military troops. And from that behavior, they got that feeling that shooting is not allowed for them. Because they had, during the weeks before, since the 9th of October, that behavior of all that military troops and troops of security not to shoot. I think this is the only understanding in which way it happened. And then, from the 9th of November, the wall was open. Not really, because it was a mixture then. You could go, and then they controlled you in the next weeks. But from December, it was really open in the end. And so the whole world saw this. And so it is a symbol. This day is a symbol of the end of the Cold War. And I think it is important to understand. I call that event the storm of the Bastille, of the revolution, peaceful revolution in Central Europe. Because it happened as a result of the revolution. This peaceful revolution in GDR happened in the framework of the Central European happenings since the beginning of '89 in Poland, Hungary, later in Czechoslovakia. So at the end, it was a Central European revolution, and the symbol for all of them is the fall of the wall. I think it is important to have that understanding, and then to understand that this peaceful revolution, this victory of freedom, pushed away not only the wall, but also the borders, and started the opportunity for unification. I think this is important, that freedom at first, and only then the process of negotiations, the process of unification could take place. And not only the German one, but also the European one. I can't tell you all of that, but I think it's to have that understanding that peaceful victory of freedom. So first step. The second step is negotiations. After that so-called negotiated revolution in Poland with the round table, not to violate the others too, although they were, as communists, our enemies. But we sat together with them to find a resolution in order to get a free election, and they wouldn't accept us on the table if they were not the thousands of people in the streets. Both belonged together. We only could act as that leading organizations or parties at the same time to having that backing from the thousands of people. Only together could bring us to that success. And so we succeeded on the one hand to have that round table, to have to clarify the conditions for the free election, and then we got the free election in East Germany. With the free election, a legitimized government, free elected parliament, and so negotiations could be done between both German states. And then in the international framework with 2+4, I served then as one of that two, together with Mr. Genscher, as two German foreign ministers, and then with the allies of the Second World War, with Mr. Baker, Mr. Shevardnadze, Mr. Hurd from Great Britain, and Mr. Dumas from France. These were the six that we negotiated and came to an end during a very short time. I, in the beginning, didn't think that it would be possible in such a short time. Mr. de Maizière, the Prime Minister in our government, in his first speech in the Parliament, said that he will hope that after 2 years, 3 years, we will have the first common delegation to the next Olympic Games. after 3 years. The end was that after half a year we had the unification. And so you see that dynamic process in that time. But then dynamic came from the people. And when I had my first talk with Mr. Shevardnadze, I brought him to Moscow 3 messages. First is, we are not the young brother getting demands and orders. We wouldn't accept it. We are free elected now, and we are a sovereign state for you. Second is, unification will come. Unification will come. You won't prevent it, whatever you do. You won't prevent it because people really would like to have it. And if we wouldn't follow that way, we would be pushed away. It was very clear that the population of East Germany wanted to have unification. And that's why this was after the election, this was our aim, this was our goal, that what we had to organize as a government. And I think it is not usual that a government has the first goal to resolve themselves. Because unification meant that it was clear that after that only one government will be there. And in the end of that process we had the federal election of Germany. And so that all belonged together, and we succeeded. It was not so easy because the third point, that was a question of the conditions, and that meant that German sovereignty ought to be established. We had the rights of the allies of the Second World War for Germany as a whole, and especially in Berlin. Berlin was not sovereign, including the governor here. And the mayor, and it was very clear this had to be resolved to get a really united sovereign state, and we needed the acceptance for that. But the people didn't understand. The people didn't understand. We negotiated in that time. We negotiated the treaty about the currency, which started in July. We started in July with unity negotiations about the treaty about unification, and we started in May with the first round of 2+4. But the 17th of June, it was a national day, the Remembrance Day of that uprising of '53, which was the national day of western part of Germany all the time. And then we had that Remembrance Day in East Germany. And that day we had to have a meeting of the parliament because it was a very busy time. We had a celebration in special act, and after that our meeting. And then group, which was not so disciplined at that time, of the Christian Democrats, the SU, and some of the left party, the Greens, today they are Greens, with Mr. Ullmann, they brought 2 motions to the parliament for immediate access to the Federal Republic of Germany. We didn't finish the negotiations. And it was really a very difficult situation to prevent that we voted about that. Because it was very clear in that day, because we had the remembrance meeting in the morning, Mr. Kohl, Genscher, and all these guys sat there, and in that situation, the majority, in my view, was very clear if we would vote these motions. And we prevented it. We prevented it and brought it to the Commission, and so we could continue with negotiations. Imagine that we didn't succeed with that managing of the procedure. Because if we wouldn't succeed with that, we would, as government, go home as citizens of the Federal Republic of Germany, resolving our government, and Mr. Kohl, at the same time, had been Chancellor of the United Germany, because this voting had been the implemented decision of unification without any clarified condition, without any finished negotiation, including all these issues of 2+4, question of alliance, and all these problems. I think it is, I give that example because it gives a picture about that dynamic situation, about the pressure of the people, including the parliamentarians. And so they were not really interested in our negotiations. They wanted unification immediately. And they thought, if we get unification immediately, if we get the currency, D-Mark, immediately, then we would get welfare immediately. This was a thinking. It seemed to be a little bit naive, and it was, but it was reality, that thinking. And so the pressure was very high for us in that negotiations, and that speeded up the situation and the process of unification. We succeeded because Gorbachev, in the end, accepted NATO membership and the full sovereignty of Germany, including NATO membership of the United Germany, after the Congress of the Communist Party in the end of June. This was a difficult time because he himself was very much under pressure in his own country, and it was not really clear would he survive that party congress. After he passed it, then he could implement what he promised in the end of May before to Mr. Bush Senior, in which he accepted sovereignty and NATO membership in the end of May before. And so he implemented it with the first Western politician, and this was Mr. Kohl in Caucasus, and so we could finish that process. There's another story with the border, with the German-Polish border, but I will come back to that. So in the end, I think it was a marvelous process for Germany, and it was important not only for Germany but for Europe as a whole, because it was important for Hungary, it was important for Poland, that they said we need a united Germany. The Democrats there thought in that way. We need a united Germany in order to get NATO and EU as neighbor, in order to get membership in the future. And so, at the same time, they tried to get a member of the Western institutions. I think, in the end, that was a crucial process, not only of uniting Germany, but also of uniting Europe. It was a completion of Europe. It was not really enlargement, because it was clear that time, because of the Cold War, was not possible that that former Eastern countries could take part in that integration process, and they started to do so, and I think it's a marvelous success that we, in the end, succeeded in 2004 or in 2007 with Romania and Bulgaria to have that membership on the one hand, and on the other hand, to have that process of stronger and deeper integration with the constitution. And then we failed because France and Netherlands, and you all know that process. But in the end, now we have the Lisbon Treaty, which is a crucial point. I think that this is a very important, not only German part of history, but also European one. And it was important for us that we, as Germans, had in the background the history of democratization and dealing with our own past. And I think it's a crucial point that Germany got international acceptance because West Germany accepted that responsibility of its own past, of Holocaust and all that was terrible happened from Germany towards whole of Europe, and that in society and in the state, there was a dealing with that. Not only feeling guilty, but also taking that responsibility of, especially of people who are not personally involved. If you see, for instance, that marvelous event 40 years ago, that a German chancellor, with Willy Brandt, that a German chancellor who was an immigrant, he fought against Hitler. He personally had no reason to ask for forgiveness, because he, together with the allies, with other enemies of Hitler, fought against him. But he took his office, going to Poland, and was kneeling there in the monument of the uprising of Jewish people in the ghetto in Warsaw. I think this photo, I think all of you know that photo. That was a very important issue, not only for Germany, but for the whole world, to understand that there are people who understand their responsibility for Europe and for the neighbors. The communists in GDR didn't do so. They felt as victors of the Second World War because they were communists, and which really the communists and the leading communists really too fought against Hitler. Kronecker was in the prison all the time, and many communists were in the concentration camps. But they brought East Germany to the communist world, and they gave the impression for all East Germans that they are not guilty. When they established the wall in '61, they gave the name that anti-fascistic wall. That has the fascists are in the West, and the good people, together with the Soviets, going to the future, are not guilty in the East. And so this we changed immediately after the free election in 1990. And then we made a declaration in which we accepted our responsibility, which belonged to our past and which is important for the future. I think this was a crucial point for us. And so on the one hand, the West Germany had decades, 4 decades of a stabilizing democracy, and an experienced democracy then, and we, with a peaceful revolution, and knowing our responsibility, that both gave us that acceptance, not only of the former allies, but also of the neighbors. And for that it was important to accept the border with Poland. It was a crucial point, and I was sometimes a little bit, not only a little bit, really angry with Mr. Kohl. He was not so clear in the beginning in that question of the border. And there was another point of that declaration which changed in Germany the Jewish community. Because we invited, as in East Germany, we invited Jewish people in Soviet Union who were there under pressure. And because they were under pressure, we invited them to come to East Germany. The Federal Republic of Government of Germany was not so happy about that, but we did. And the government refused to bring that invitation into the Unification Treaty, but in the end, they continued that. And the following is, and the impact is that now we have up to 2005, 220,000 Jewish people from all countries of the former Soviet Union coming to Germany. And so we have a really completely changed, but more crowded Jewish community in Germany. I would like to come back to the question of human rights, which is an important point, because I really think that we have to learn, and you mentioned it before, the question of democracy. Our experience is that democracy cannot be established from outside. It was very important that we had the framework of Western countries, especially with the Helsinki process, giving us opportunity to have contacts with the West, to be supported from there. But in the end, I would say, the end of the Cold War was not the victory of the West against the East. It was the victory of the values, which especially people in eastern part of Europe, including East Germany, we had that success and victory because we shared the values with the West. And it is important, that wording, because if it had been a victory of the West against the East, it would include the people and their self-understanding, that they are defeated at that time. But exactly the opposite is the case. The people in East Germany, they had the success because they trusted in, they fought in the end for freedom and democracy, and they succeeded with that sharing that common values with the West. And so I think this has the effect for the future, how to deal with authoritarian states. In my view, it is important that we in every case have to invest in that people in these countries who would like to fight for democracy and freedom, who are ready to do something there. And so our investment is to support and give assistance to civil society, to give assistance to democratic opposition. This is a crucial point for every change, and in my view, a very important condition for every change. It could be that it's not a sufficient condition, and it happened that sometimes, if you see Iran last year, that it is not succeeding. But it is important that change only can be done. There are some other things in the framework of the question of power, the question of the international security, question of neighbors, and all this has to be included. But I think an important point is that there has to be a part of the population which is sharing the values, which we can do much, in my view, to support such people in these countries. And besides this, we should be in dialogue with the governing and official institutions, but not one or the other. As usual, we in the European Union, for instance, if you see the Belarus strategy or Cuba strategy, very often we are doing the one or the other. And if the common standpoint of the European Union towards Cuba from the 90s is saying that we ask for democracy and limit the contacts to the officials. In my view, we had in every case, we have to support opposition and democratic powers in that country. And besides that, if they are ready to have contact with the officials and doing such things to convince them, to tell them the truth and our opinion, but on the other hand, to give them some pressure and dialogue. And so you can see, similar as it was done by the West in the Helsinki process, with economic cooperation, some things can change too. There's another field I wanted, but I can't really add, about the question of minorities. I think really that is a crucial point. I personally experienced it when I was first time as a young student in Transylvania, where I had the experience with German minority, far away to find German minority. It was really a very emotional experience for me. But on the other hand, see there that there was a Hungarian German minority, many Roma, and this situation of Ceausescu. With all that difficulties, it it was a very interesting experience for me. And having that in background, I experienced in 1989 a meeting, an assembly of churches in Basel. It was the first time that churches, Catholic and Protestant churches, met at one place in spring '89 in Basel to the Assembly of Churches for Justice and Peace. And there it was amazing to see that people from, you could have the impression, living in different centuries. A young priest from Netherlands with jeans, and then on the other hand from the Orthodox Church, and you could think that's the Middle Age in the whole delegations. But they all came together and talked about the future. In that assembly, it was that the question of minorities is only the question of Eastern Europe. And I didn't agree with that, because if you see Ireland, Basque, and so on, you see other countries too with in the West and with their difficulties. But it was clear, and that's why in the 19th it was changed, that Europe was not really prepared in that point. Europe was not prepared and had to make clear what does it mean, that the rights of minorities. And so the Convention about Human Rights, the European, was changed and added with a question of minorities, which in my view is really a crucial point. And I myself made a proposal last year after the European election that in my view it would be good that if the European Commission would establish a commissioner for minorities. Because we have now, with the Lisbon Treaty, good regulations by law. But the question of implementation, of awareness, what does it mean to care for the rights of minorities, there's, in my view, a big gap and lack. And what happens now in France is only an example about that. I personally think, for instance, that it is, had to be prevented that Roma in Germany too would brought back by pressure to Kosovo, because the situation in Kosovo is not right, is not good prepared for that. And so I think this is another field which would be very important. The last point I would like to mention is the question of dealing with the past. I really think, I mentioned it before, that it was, in my view, a precondition of acceptance of Germany, that we dealt with our past in the National Socialism time. And we started after unification, and not only after, in the time of the free elected parliament, we started with dealing with the communist past too. We established, it was mentioned when you presented my biography, I made the proposal in the 90s, and we established a commission over 2 periods in the parliament about dealing with that past and the effects of that past. And I really am convinced that it is important to deal especially with injustice and problems in our past, because only from that we get and we become sensible about problems, about violations of human rights, which are not happening far away, and we can see it in TV. There's another sensibility if we see that we ourselves are affected, that our families, our fathers, our parents were involved. Then we can ask, how could it happen? How could it happen? What could be done in a society dealing with people who are different, people who are with other ethnic roots? All this, in my view, is a crucial point for a democratic country to get involved, because democracy and the question of human rights is not only a question of structures, it's a question of a political culture, and it it is very important that we get it in our minds, that we get it in our dialogues in the society with support of the state, that this kind of dealing with past is going on, and saying that because we are together here, I belong to that people in 1995 who promoted and pushed it very much, that motion in the German Bundestag about the Armenian genocide, because I think we as Germans, for instance, took part in that. We were part. We were allies in the First World War. We were allies, and our diplomats and our military persons were in the, it was not Turkey, the current Turkey, it was the Ottoman Empire in that time, and all these knowledge came to Germany. And there was, for instance, one German pastor who made that public and published it and made a book and sent it to every parliamentarian. And by the German police, it was prevented that the parliamentarians got that papers. And they got it only 2 years later, after the First World War. And so I think it is important that we, our own history, deal with that very transparent and very openly, and only then we can solve and conciliate situations with our neighbors. We had that discussions about past, including the last months and years between Germany and Poland, for instance. That's another issue. But I can tell you that I'm really convinced that that questions of dealing with own past, on the one hand, the question of human rights and sensibility, and to establish an international legal system in which we can make strong that human rights have to be protected. That's crucial. And the last sentence is, that's not only the question of states, it's not only the question of structures, it's a question of engaged people, it's a question of engaged civil society, pushing it, making it public, pushing their own parties, their own governments, in order to make transparent and public where people are violated in their personal dignity, in their rights. And I think exactly that is a challenge for all of us. We never will have a situation in our states in which it can't happen. It can happen because we are people and we are ourselves able to fail, and very often we do. And so it's important that there's a transparent situation, that there's a civil society fighting for the dignity of the people. And we, when we 20 years ago got German unification, one reason, one motivation was that the first article in the German constitution, the basic law, is that we have to protect the human dignity of every person. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much for, I think, one of the most exciting speeches that we've heard, and I think on such a historic time to have had this speech here in the city on this date really has, I think, historic significance. So thank you very, very much. If it's okay with you, we'll have a few questions and comments from the audience.
If you're not hungry,
please raise your hand. Briefly introduce yourself, and I would say let's limit it maybe to one question to each person to try to allow for as many voices as possible. I think you were the first.
Thank you very much for hearing the peaceful revolution and German reunification. Myself, I come from South and Southeast Asia. We were divided during colonial period under three administrative provincial administration. At that time, Burma, Assam, and Bengal. So the British themselves tried to put us together again in their Historic Chin-Lusay Conference 1892 in Calcutta. But they keep pending because of the communication and others and so many things. But our area had been administered under Foreign Jurisdiction Act in each area. And we have got these Bengal Eastern Frontier regulations to protect others from entering to our country. Though we are under the administrative, some portion in India and some portion in Bangladesh and some portion in Burma. And we are in a contiguous area. And we are fighting this, our reunification for the last 118 years, but not yet completed. So when we are thinking of this ICD inviting us to attend in this meeting, and we admire the German peoples who had a peaceful revolution and German reunification has been attained, which had been divided in 1945 after 50 years. But the same people had divided the Zhou people 50 years ahead of the German division. But we have still fighting, not yet succeed. So I want to know how also we are going to have a peaceful revolution and reunification of Zhou people could come out. That is why we like to hear very much what type of things we have to follow so that the Zhou people may also reunify under one administrative head. That is my question. Thank you.
Okay, or better is to collect some. I think so.
Sure.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, I think you're next.
Hello, my name is Laura Biagioni. I come from Italy, and I wanted to tell you that I agree absolutely about the issue that Germany did an admission of responsibility about what in the Second World War was happening. Things that in Italy, in my point of view, didn't happen. Otherwise, we wouldn't have the situation that we have at the moment. But I also realized, living in Germany since some years, that there are some movements, okay, that try to make a kind of propaganda, okay, of this neo-Nazis idea, and I'm sure that there has been some energies put to avoid that something was happening again, like what was happening. Nonetheless, there are some exponents, not just from the NPD, but there is some movements that are more located in East Berlin. Okay, we need just to go to Lichtenberg, Marzahn, and this kind of area where there is still this kind of propaganda. And I would like to know if there is some social project or because this for sure is a lack of culture in the young people. Okay, if there is some social project to avoid that this kind of propaganda is going on, because actually there are Nazi demonstrations. There are people going in the street and making demos with the Nazi cross and whatever. So this is my question. I'm really wondering about this. How is possible?
Is there a third question? Okay.
Yes, my name is Darnell Summers, and I'm affiliated with the ICD. It's not just a question of neo-Nazis and right-wing groups organized here. Since the fall of the wall, there have been almost 100 people have been killed, murdered by these right-wing forces. And the overwhelming majority of them have been people of African descent. Now, if you've covered some of the situation before the fall of the wall, and even His Excellency, Mr. Taxis talked about Turkey beginning to examine the past 1980 and before, and the excesses of the military government. But to what extent, at this particular time, do we know the identity of the people who have killed almost 100 people, if not more? And I think that if we talk about human rights and we talk about some form of democracy, then within that, there must be some struggle, some movement to arrive at justice for the people who have been murdered. Now, I'm going to keep my comment brief. There is a hotel here in Berlin, and they put on a show. And I'm from Detroit, and a friend of mine came over to sing at this hotel. And she was given a BVG Karte, A, B, C. That means there's an A region, a B zone, and a C zone. She was told in no uncertain terms, she's a black woman, that she was not to go into the C zone. And so, I mean, there are people here who live under that pressure. They live under the pressure of constant attack from fascist, Nazi, right-wing, whatever you want to call them, forces. And that's a reality. And as I said before, people have died. We need to, and I'm not suggesting that you're responsible for that. That would be ridiculous. And I think that everyone here is for human rights. So I want to make that clear. But I think that we have to draw attention to that, and some action must be taken to clarify that issue.
I can't give you a clear explanation. But I can tell you that that happened starting during the demonstrations for freedom. I have a friend, he comes from Mozambique. He lived in East Germany because the communists invited people from different countries to work and to get educated, and at the same time they tried to influence them with that communist ideology, and they lived in East Germany, but they lived there more in a ghetto, not really with good contact in the population. And so we got the impression in the 80s, in the end of the 80s, that there is some pressure against such people. And I started in a church. I had such a seminar. I chaired it close to Magdeburg. I started with that issue, a group dealing with that problems. And I invited them. It was that time of changing in the autumn of '89. And we made a seminar, and they told me that these black people too came to the demonstrations fighting for freedom. And at the same time, they were pushed away, they were oppressed during the demonstrations. And exactly that's a problem. That people, and that's not only in East Germany the case, that people who feel free have to learn that freedom not only means my own, but also means to accept the tolerance and tolerance the dignity of the others too. That's why I think it was very important to establish structures not only of personal freedom, but structures of right, structures of in a legal situation with the rule of law. And this is what people never learned in the communist time. In communist time, it is a part of the ideology, of the communist ideology, that law is an instrument of the governing elite. And you can use it. And it was interesting in thinking that people who were lawyers, that they made a declaration in autumn '89. They made a declaration and wanted to show that they are now not for the communists, but now for democracy. And so they made a declaration saying, now we would like to use right in favor of democracy. They didn't understand that right is not an instrument to be used for anything else. That right is a question of managing different interests by clear procedures. That right is giving everybody the same dignity and the same opportunities in society and so on. This is a real deep problem in the society, and it's very difficult to overcome it, especially if people, if you have, I can't describe it as a reason, but I think it's influencing it. If you have an unemployment rate of more than 20%, in some areas more than 30, if you have desperation between people, although their welfare is better than before, but they are feeling not accepted in the society. There are in East Germany many who are feeling being second-class citizen in the society, although it's not right in my view. But we have to take it serious that there is such feeling. I can add some things more, but I can't really describe why it happens. I wouldn't say that wouldn't like to mention that similar things are happening all over Europe. I know, and you know, that it's happening. And on the other hand, what I mentioned with dealing with the past, in GDR, in the communist time, it was every time clear that the communists were against that dictatorship, but there was no dealing in the education about own involvement. Exactly that was not the case. People were acknowledged as belonging to the victors of the Second World War because we are a communist society and communism is representing the future and anticipating the future. And so dealing with prejudice, dealing with differences in a society, all that was never learned in a communist society. And so it's very difficult to learn that society is not black or white, that usually human life is different degrees of gray. Another point, that compromise is a crucial point of human being and human life and behavior. And nobody is possessing the truth. All this is it with the background of communism, which has to get learned and which has to get experienced in your own communication. And this is what we have to do. The question of India, I can't solve that problem really. I think there are some criteria which we experienced 20 years ago, that it was crucial to go a non-violent way. That was crucial for the acceptance in the end. The second point is that it needs not only a minority following their own aims. I am sometimes doubting that willingness of being independent is really the willing of the majority of that population. I have some doubts about that, and sometimes I think it's a question of a part of good educated fighting elites, but people like to live in welfare. People like to live in acceptance of their special identities. And that's not a question of independent states. It's a question of minority rights. Could be a question of autonomy. There are different legal opportunities which could be found in a state. And it is needed to bring people fighting for that in a peaceful way. This was our experience, and I think that it will be crucial that the way and the instruments are really non-violent. Yes, this was a similar question. I can't answer in a special way too. Mm-hmm.
Okay, should we take maybe one more round of questions?
Yes.
I guess we'll start in the front, maybe.
My question is just to help the ICD regarding the question of the Zo brother. I think the ICD is an institute of cultural diplomacy, and it is not their job or task to deal with the problem of unification of the people of your country, or I don't know, whatever it is. But since you started to ask the same question from the beginning up to now, and I think the ICD was not able to tell him that this is not the forum where he will find a question to his problem. I think they take it into account. It's registered somewhere that there is such issues, and probably at a higher level, they will find the right forum where this kind of issues can be resolved. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for your comment, and we'll discuss this actually tomorrow also in terms of the future, because the Institute would actually very much like to get involved and support a number of initiatives. But I'd suggest let's keep the questions focused for Mr. Meckel for now. But thank you for the response. And again, if you could please briefly introduce yourself, Elsa.
Hello, my name is Victor Melendez, and I'm from Puerto Rico in the Caribbean. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to say something about something that what I found, what I have observed in this Congress. We've been always talking about the relationship between democracy and the human rights. That is obviously very important, because the human rights are philosophically structured to protect us from ourselves, basically. So, but I want to appoint something. We are always talking about democracy as an important actor, but democracy is actually a tool that respond to a higher center of organization. It is one kind of political organization to a territory, but it is strictly related to the system organization of nation state. And when I'm talking about nation state is the structure of a system to dominate or make a stand on a certain level on a delimited territory, and it is a force that includes some and also excludes some. I don't know if I'm making this clear, but the nation state is obviously a tool that organize the world in order to exclude somebody. And how we can conciliate a system that is built on that basis to respect the human rights in a universal level? That's what I'm asking.
Okay, so we can go to the philosophical seminar, but
Take
it's
maybe-
very important.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Janessa Dax, and my background is actually in education, and that's something that I'd like to maybe have addressed. What role did education play in the sort of the peaceful revolution and reunification? Because I think I think the next generation is very important in this whole story. So.
I think two more.
Okay, Peter Kirschläger from the Center for Human Rights Education, Lucerne, Switzerland. My question would actually be in addition to your question and the question from you, in the sense that I would be wondering, as you're also a politician, my impression is that this problem we have in Europe in general, not just in Germany, about right-wing movements which are really very powerful and a threat to a certain amount of our populations. If this not has also to do, when you were talking about your experience, you were kind of saying, well, the external contracts you could refer to, or certain kind of structures where you could meet, like the churches, were important for your movement. What I see from my practice is that we have like right-wing organizations which are very well organized. They can work on long-term goals. They work for 10, 20 years with strategies. And on the other hand, we have people fighting these movements which have to fight for project-funded money, like for 3 years, and then have to evaluate after 2 years to get another funding which they don't receive. So kind of, fighting with different kind of arms, in parentheses. So my question would be if that wouldn't be possible to do with your experience, with your weight as a politician, to start something which really could, on the European level, improve the structure and the contracts which movements which try to fight racism, discrimination on a European level could have a better context to do that. Thanks.
Final question.
Thank you. My name is Mattima Grassi. I come from Italy, postdoc researcher at the University of Trento. And my question deals with the approach of Germany to its role on the global scenario and European integration 20 years after unification. I'm saying this because coming here on the plane, I read a commentary on a major Italian newspaper saying very briefly that the wall was not only an instrument of division between, but served as a sort of mirror in which both parties of Europe could see their European identity. This was true for Germans also, but also for all the peoples living not only in the western side of the wall, but also for Hungarians, for people in Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria. And that 20 years later, this is not true anymore, that the nation state is in playing a big role again, and this is true for the political crisis of the European Union, and the commentary was very provocative against, for example, the demand of Germany of a permanent seat in the Security Council. That is considered an evidence of a new approach as a nation state, and again, in opposition to an approach to European integration. I wanted you, if you can comment on this. Thank you.
So it's a pity for you. You will die or will not get anything to eat, because because if I would like ought really to respond to all these questions, it will be 3 other lectures, and especially the last one is alone 2 of them. But I will try to shorten it a little bit, so at midnight we can finish. The question of democracy, I think really that's a very crucial point, because it's a question of inclusion and participation. That's what I understood. What your point was. I would say that democracy is always a legal structure for dealing with different interests and give them a clear procedure and regulations. And because legal framework in every case means a limited, because accepted from a special population or a special part of the world, accepted legal framework which includes everybody and gives everybody the same rights. And we have that limitation as a precondition, because we can't make our principles as a general principle for all of the world. That's the first point. So the question is, it includes everybody in the inner room, but it excludes for that legal framework all that who are not citizens. That's not mean citizens, not living in. That's a difference. It's a difference. And for instance, when we had 10 years ago new president, Johannes Rau, when he became president, and he made in his first speech, he related himself to that first article in the Constitution, saying it's a human dignity, and not only the dignity of citizens. That meant in that time, because of that problems you mentioned, that everybody who is living here has to be accepted with the same dignity. Also, he's only seeking, for instance, for asylum, although he has a different status of living here. That's a crucial point. And it was a step forward, for instance, that our new president today put that point, because his speech today in that anniversary speech was about integration, because that is a crucial point for our society today. And not only for our German, but also our European, as I think. So that's the first point. Inclusion is not the question that others are expelled, but in every case, legal framework is a special and a limited one all over the world. The second point for democracy is the question of rule of law. And not what I mentioned before, that law and right is not an instrument for a third goal. I think that's a crucial point for understanding law and democracy. And then democracy is not only a legal framework, is not only regulation of laws, of procedures to deal with different interests and so on. It is also a political culture. And that's the most difficult, that people have to learn it to deal with that. And that is what I mentioned before, the question of tolerance, the question of acceptance of the dignity of other people, the ability for dialogue, the ability to find consensus or agreements by compromises. If you come from for instance, from the communist background, the ideology is that you have to learn the truth, which is fixed, and all other people think in another way, they are wrong. And you have, on the one hand, to convince them or oppress them. That's quite another behavior. And that is the long and ongoing effort we have to do for education, as one of you mentioned, that education is a crucial point, which is not ended whenever. But because again and again we have to learn exactly that. And that's only if a civil society, if a public is there controlling each other, raising issues each other, violating human rights. If state is violating human rights too, the origin of human rights is against the state. That the state is not allowed to violate the rights of the people. But at the same time, it is that nobody in the state has that right. So I think this is the point. Democracy can only be established for a special entity, but democracy promotion, that means that values, that understanding has via dialogue, via communication, via support, which for people who are convinced in that, it can only develop in that way, giving a framework, giving space for people who are engaged in that way, fighting in authoritarian or dictatorships for that. And the question is, how do we deal with people who come to our country? And then it is the same. We have to behave them as human beings with the same rights, including that it could be the suspicion that they're terrorists. And so it's a very difficult field. We go there with Guantanamo, with Abu Ghraib. It means that everybody has the right for legal structures at the court to be not only to be attacked, but to protect himself, to get a lawyer, and so on. All these belongs to acceptance of rule of law, acceptance of the dignity of other people, although they are really quite other than me. The question of EU context against extremism. I'm not so sure that this at first is a question of European Union. It could be that European Union can help to give some money for such kind of campaign. But my experience is, for instance, that if you see only Germany, we have in Brandenburg, since the beginning, the state Brandenburg, from the beginning of the 90s, a program for such kind of education, how to deal with extremists, with people to learn democracy. Because it is not, you can't fight extremism. If you see extremism, it's a long time before. You have to ask what are people behaving if they experience extremism. Do they look away? Do they run away? Let they do, or try they to intervene? Or are they applauding in their inner if such things are happening? And this question, how to deal with different ethnics, how to deal with different behavior and religion, how to behave towards minorities, what kind of minorities it is. It's not only ethnic one. All this belongs to that kind of education. And I think that we have, for instance, in Brandenburg, some good experiences with that work, and special institutions were established about that. And then, because such things happened, as you mentioned, in Germany, then policy is sometimes very active, because it happened, and the next day we need a solution. And then immediately money is there to give money, but there's no good instruments there how to deal with that money. Activismus, how to call it in activism, which is short-minded. often in politics, and I am a little bit afraid if you bring it to the European level, where and who is there really in a long-term education and communication, really to establish strategies which are possible in such different societies as Poland, Hungary, Germany, Portugal, France, and whatever. I think differentiation is better. It could be that some money could be there and you can get it for that, but the strategies have to be established and done for a special situation. You have to have in the background of a society. If I see, for instance, the Hungarians, you have a split society. It is almost not possible to have a conference and from both different camps, political camps of the country, to bring people to the same table. Today, they are members of European Union. And it is the case that is very difficult. And so that's why I'm a little bit skeptical about European programs in that way. And now the last long lecture about Germany and foreign policy. I agree that German unification, but not only German unification, but also the independency of sovereign states after communism was a special situation after that breakthrough of democracy 20 years ago. And we have to understand, and many people in the West didn't understand, that that kind of a national awareness, the awareness of national identity of people in the Soviet Union. If you see the Baltic states, they were occupied for decades. And then they got the opportunity to be sovereign countries. After many decades, it was very clear that they were proud to be Estonians, to be Latvians, and so on. That has to be understood, and that they have had to solve the question that 40% of the population of that country were Russians, brought from the Soviet Union there, and how to deal with that. On the one hand, to accept that these Russians have the same rights, but on the other hand, to establish really that Estonian or Latvian identity in that country. You know all that difficulties which we had with European Union, OSCE, and so on, with van der Stoel, to get and find good ways for that. But I think at first it has to be understood that including national identity could be an important part and dimension of reaching freedom. But the danger is clear. We had that danger not only there, but we had that experiences in the Balkan, in the former Yugoslavia, in which on the one hand they wanted to be independent, on the other hand their own behavior towards their own minorities. And if I say on the one hand, I think that it is important to accept the independency of Kosovo, but it is a long way, and we have to push the politicians there, but not only the politicians, we have to help to develop acceptance not only for Kosovars and not only for Serbs, but also for Roma living there, which is not the case today. Roma can't live there freely in that country. That's why I think I'm against to bring people there from Germany. And so this is a really difficult situation. So on the one hand, I think we in Europe, we have to live with national states. But we have to understand that what is the task of states, usually we can't do alone in Europe. Welfare, if you see the economic situation, welfare can't by a national state alone be served for the people or cared for the people. Security, environment, environmental situation, all of that, and there's only 3 examples, all of that has to be done together. And so in my view, a responsible state has to be not only accept, has to bring forward deeper integration. And I would say it's a German interest go forward with that integration. This was for a long time the second identity of Germany, and that's why I personally was really angry in some situations in which we violated that policy. I can give you 2 examples for that. One point was the right decision, my personal view, the right decision of Chancellor Schröder not to take part in the Iraq war. I really convinced that it was a right decision. But the way he implemented it, in my view, was a problem. To bring together France and Russian, the 3 big with Germany, and neglecting the little partners in Europe. That had a tendency to destroy what we in our speeches said all the time. We are in favor of common European foreign policy. He himself said it, but at the same time, he didn't implement it because of that so-called Achse. That was a problem. The same with the current government now. If I see that we have really a wonderful chance after the Lisbon Treaty agreed, after a very, very difficult process, we agreed with the Lisbon Treaty to establish a foreign policy with more integration and to establish the institutions for that. And in the same time, developing a new strategic concept for NATO, which gives the opportunity to reflect in a new way the EU-NATO relationship, which is with Cyprus and Turkey another problem. I can't mention it more. But to have that chance, and then Germany is doing nothing, or worse. On the one hand, nothing. I haven't seen any initiative from Germany during the last years really to bring forward a concept with NATO EU and with EU itself. And then the personal issue, together with France, to look for people who are as weak as possible, not to strengthen the European institutions, which we experienced, is a disaster in my view. You can add it with other things, with Greece and so on. I only would like to bring these 2 points. So I think this is what we have to debate, to be very frank, to be very clear, because in my view, it's our interest. It's really, I'm deeply convinced, it's our interest to make strong Europe. And that means to make strong European institutions. If we see the security issues, that we as Germans in our law have the question of the staff in NATO or in troops in EU. In my view, it is not possible, it is not good that we as parliament say, if we don't take part in an action, then the staff has to be put out too. That's crazy, because staffs have to be established in an integrated structure. And although, for instance, if we would not take part in an action, we had to leave that staff officers in the staff in order to make function that integrated security structures. That's only some example, but we could continue it in a long way. But I really think that it is our national interest to establish that international and especially European structures. And the last point, your question with the seat in the Security Council. In that point, I would say the best would be to change the structure to make it possible that European Union could get 2 or 3 places. This would be the best. But the treaty is not so. And so the first step would be, and Germany never said, we would like to be there, neglecting the others. If you remember, 5 years ago, that was very clear that it was from the other continents have to be included. It has to be really a restructured situation. And I think that Germany really can take part much. And I think that a behavior, which is not the case with France and Great Britain. Never it happened that Great Britain and France brought their decision-making process to the EU to discuss about that, and in the end, to follow the agreed line. This would be a good step. I can't see that it has happened. But that exactly was with Mr. Schröder, when the Germany 5 years ago had the same aim, said we would do so. We would, and by that, by example, we would like to press a European communication about our own voting in the Security Council. So I think there are some good arguments for that, but the priority is not the German seat. The priority is the reform of the Security Council. That has to be clear.